Welcome back, folks. Okay, so we just covered in our last video the revolution itself as well as the cultural impacts. What we're going to focus on now is sort of what happens now that America is independent. Specifically, we are looking at the different types of government that appear in the country as a direct result of this. We are looking at the Articles of Confederation today, as well as the Constitutional Convention leading to the U.S. Constitution as we know it. And finally, we'll take a look at the Washington presidency, just seeing a little bit of this new Constitution actually applied with our first president. All right, let's get into it. Okay, so now that America is independent, we saw that the Second Continental Congress was only a temporary governing body. And so it's actually during the Revolution itself that these articles are written. And with that in mind, we see that they are very different than British Parliament. Basically, at this point in time, a strong government was seen as a government that could take away your rights. And in particular, they were trying to avoid that at all costs. So, Mr. John Dickinson, one of our moderates earlier, he's going to write these, and the government will be made weak on purpose. It's going to be much harder to make laws under these articles here. In particular, you need two-thirds of the states to actually vote in favor of a law to actually approve it. So in this case, since there are 13 states, that means 9 states have to approve it. There is only one vote per state, so that means every state gets exactly one vote, no matter its size. Rhode Island has the same voting power as New York. And so the other thing is that effectively means that since the central government has so little actual power, in effect, the states are really more like 13 separate countries that just happen to work together for things like mutual defense and all that. This government cannot tax its people because taxation kind of started this whole mess in the first place. We see that any amendments to these articles have to be completely unanimous, and that will never happen. There are several states that love being fiercely independent. In particular, itty bitty Rhode Island, right in there. They are scoundrels about that. But yeah, so this government is very ineffective. And at the time, that seemed like a good idea. But as we quickly learn, that is in fact a source of major dysfunction very quickly. So, this government is in effect from about 1781 until 1787 when it is abandoned for the Constitutional Convention. But it did do a couple things right. Namely, the issues that it did was it resolved a lot of land disputes. We see that after the Treaty of Paris is signed, we get all this land up to the Mississippi River. And as you can see on this map, that meant that a bunch of colonies, well, colonies now states, I keep saying that, they are just going to start laying claim to whatever territory they can just rush out there and snatch up as quickly as possible. So you see, Massachusetts here is super long. It's going to completely pass New York, jump over that little bit of land that belongs to Canada, and just claim this Great Lakes region in modern day Minnesota and Wisconsin and Michigan. And so there's a bunch of examples of this, and the states are very aggressive about land policy. We saw that really mattered during the Revolution days with things like, Pontiac's Rebellion and the Proclamation line. My bad. So this could have gone very badly. Like this, right? This by itself could have resulted in some kind of war between the 13 states if it wasn't handled properly. But this new Articles government is going to intervene, and through about 4 years of negotiations, they will convince all these states to slowly give up the land that they just haphazardly laid claim to, and instead allow the federal government to decide how that land is dispersed. And with that in mind, we see two pieces of legislation that are very important that show up as a great example of a successful land policy under the Articles. The first one, the aptly named land ordinances. Basically, all that land out there now, it's going to be not given out to states, but to individuals. And what they're going to do is they're going to map out all of that land, divide it up into a big fancy grid, and they're going to call each 6 mile square patch of these grids townships. Those townships are divided into 36 smaller sections, and in particular, those can then be bought by individuals, either a whole section of that, half of it, or even a quarter. And they're very reasonable prices, like about $1 per acre, which means about, a couple $100 for an entire section there. It's not cheap, but it is certainly affordable. And so what we see is that this whole area, they're going to now have a much more orderly system to actually sell this land to people that want it. But also, the proceeds for selling that land are going to be used to fund this new federal government. And remember, since this government can't tax its citizens, that's a very big deal. This is now the primary source of income for this region. Also, they're going to use it to promote things like public education. A couple of those squares are reserved for things like that. That's the land ordinances. The Northwest ordinances, on the other hand, it's going to set up the territory system of the United States. There are a lot of new regions up here in this kind of Great Lakes region up here at the top, as I'm going to try and draw with my circle here. This whole region up here in yellow is going to be the Northwest Territory. They're going to organize that whole area into a region that is not exactly a state, but it is still less, I mean, more than unstructured land. Now, what this also does is it sets up a system by which a territory can apply to then become a state in the future. Basically, as their population grows, their government will evolve from becoming just a regional governor to an actual elected council. And then finally, when their population passes 60,000, they can then apply to become a state. And so, really, these policies, the land and Northwest ordinances, they're going to become major precedents well into the future, long after the articles are actually gone. So those are good to know as the big examples of the articles winning. But most of what they do is pretty atrocious. We see that because they can't tax, they have no way to pay off debts that we incurred to other countries during the war, like the Netherlands, for example. We see that inflation is going to only skyrocket. We printed so much money during the war to keep us afloat. We have no way to reel that in right now. We see that it is going to lead to not just economic woes, but also it's going to lead to various examples of political discontent. A lot of soldiers that fought in the war can't get paid. And in particular, that's going to lead to a lot of discontent. One major example is something called the Newburgh Conspiracy, or a bunch of officers, after the fighting is over, they're going to basically be so fed up with not getting paid, they're going to orchestrate pretty much a coup against the government in Philadelphia. And if it weren't for the intervention of George Washington appealing to their better natures and basically saying that he's so old and given so much for his country, it might have happened. Meanwhile, we're getting bullied by other countries. We see that we have no way to negotiate with them. Britain is going to keep their troops in that northwest region, even though they said they wouldn't in the Treaty of Paris. Spain is going to close the Mississippi River, and any attempts to trade with them fail or to get it open fail. And so, really, we're floundering. And lastly, Shays' Rebellion, that sort of movement of a bunch of discontented farmers almost taking over Massachusetts because of no taxation and therefore people getting thrown in jail for not paying off their debts. That was perhaps the biggest thing to scare the powers that be into the Constitutional Convention. We see Philadelphia, we're going to have a convening people like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and they're going to use the convention ostensibly to make the articles better, to pass things like tariffs to raise money. But in reality, they just kind of hijack the whole thing and say, what if we just abandoned the articles and we just made something better, something stronger? And in particular, they're not looking for a full democracy, but what they do involve is a Republican style government where rather than the people themselves directly having votes on major policy or laws, what the people do is instead elect somebody to go to a place like Congress, and that elected representative is the one who actually enacts the will of the people. So it's sort of like a buffer where it's not a tyranny of the crown, we have a democracy, but it is also not a tyranny of the mob. Because again, people like Hamilton thought that ordinary people were kind of dumb and didn't know what they actually wanted. So, what that means is that we have a certain level of buffering there. But also, we also enact a process called federalism, where we are separating state and federal power. Each government, the state governments, all 13 of them, and this new national government that we're making stronger, They each have different roles and do different things. And so that means not necessarily either one of them is better or worse than the other. So all of these things, they're showing a much more concerted effort to balance out the flaws of the articles, but also not get tyranny. Basically, how do we balance liberty with order? All right. And so the biggest issue at the Constitutional Convention was how many votes, how many representatives does each state get? We saw James Madison, the hidden hand of this whole thing, in my opinion. He proposes the Virginia plan, where we have two houses and they're both based on population. So the bigger states get more votes because there are more people living in those states. Obviously, the big states liked that plan and the smaller states did not. The smaller states will counter with the New Jersey plan, and it keeps the articles system of only one house, a unicameral house, and one vote per state. So that would benefit the small states more, and the big states would have much less power. This was a major source of contention for a long while here because really both sides refused to back down. And it wasn't until a savior shows up from Connecticut, we have the Great Compromise that appears, the Connecticut Plan, where we have the two house system that Madison proposed. But each house will abide by one of these two systems. We have this upper house, the Senate, and that house will adhere to the New Jersey plan. We see that they also, the lower house, the House of Representatives, they will abide by the Virginia plan and have the whole population based system. So, in theory, the smaller states will get to control the Senate's votes, and the bigger states will get to control the House of Representatives. But laws have to be approved by both of them in order to actually become law. And so, this system allowed everyone to get a little bit of what they want, and it was enough to make everyone happy enough to move on until the issue of slavery showed up. Sadly, slavery was a big source of contention here, not for moral reasons, but because the high slave population in the South meant that this might be a chance for them to artificially boost their numbers, even though enslaved people have no actual voting rights. We see that after a lot of bickering back and forth, the result is the infamous three-fifths compromise, where we see that the enslaved population of the South will count, everyone will count as three-fifths of a person when it comes to figuring out the amount of representatives each slave state gets. The South got that in the compromise. The North, meanwhile, they wanted to balance the scales by making taxation a bigger deal. So we see that they allow for the remaining two-fifths of these enslaved people to be counted as property to then be taxed. So the South pays more taxes in exchange for this inflated vote count. It is very notorious. It is cruel and unfair, but it's what they could live with. Sad to say. On top of that, we saw there was also that slave trade clause, where basically the international slave trade will be banned 20 years from now. And it actually does happen, except the domestic slave trade perseveres. All right? Very briefly through the rest of this, executive branch, we get a president. They're elected by the electoral college, not directly by the people. So, preventing that tyranny of the mob. And then the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, is decided to help handle disputes between the states, but in truth, their role is very undefined. They have a lot of things they're going to give themselves the power to do later. So, meanwhile, this is then sent to the states to then be ratified. And here's where the debate really begins. We have a faction of here's called the Federalists who like the federal government, the Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists who don't. The Federalists see it as a big improvement over the previous Articles government, and they're going to support it with something called the Federalist Papers, basically a campaign written by Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay to convince people that even though we are making the government stronger, it won't mean tyranny. We have to work together in this new system based on things like the Great Compromise. And so it assures everyone's voice is heard and no one's voice is louder. Meanwhile, the anti-federalists, they think that a big government is tyranny, straight up. We just fought a war over exactly this. And so they're going to argue that The only way we'll sign off on this Constitution is if individual rights are directly and explicitly protected. And the way they're going to do that is with a Bill of Rights. So we have the first 10 amendments to this Constitution that are then drafted up, and they are basically all things that protect individual rights. Freedom of speech and religion, the right to bear arms, the freedom from search, the right to a process, a trial by jury, all these things that protect what the courts can do to you. Once those appear, the Anti-Federalists are okay with this whole system and they sign off on it. And so suddenly, the Constitution becomes law. Now, the other thing, we see that once the Constitution actually takes effect, we have the first president, George Washington. And so he is elected by a huge margin. And really, his first job as president is just kind of set up what other presidents do in the future. He establishes a lot of norms, like he uses the veto power very sparingly. He sets up the idea of a cabinet, a board of advisors. And really, he fleshes out the judicial system, creating the Judiciary Act of 1789, creating the federal court system. More on that in the next video. Now, meanwhile, the biggest thing is going to be his goal was to stabilize the failing economy from the Articles. And Alexander Hamilton does a bang up job doing that by his plan called funding and assumption. Basically, Hamilton needed to continue to borrow money to stabilize the system, and he's going to do that by basically redeeming a bunch of the old war bonds that were released by the Articles government. He's going to basically exchange them at face value for these new bonds, and he will then convince people to buy these bonds in exchange for interest payments. So he basically uses it as a fundraising system to both fund the government, but also by making regular payments on those loans, it allows for us to show other countries that we are good enough to actually keep making regular payments. That improves our credit with other countries. And with that, it means they're much more willing to lend us money in the future. That's how we keep funding our system. Perhaps the biggest thing, though, is in order to do this, we need something called a national bank, the Bank of the United States. It's going to oversee this whole system as well as offer loans to manufacturers and stuff like that, but also possibly even favor our own currency. And that's where we have a problem. Thomas Jefferson and several others are going to notice that there's nothing in the Constitution that says the word bank. Hamilton is going to counter with the idea that there is something called the necessary and proper clause, the elastic clause of the Constitution. And it says that Congress has the power to do whatever it needs to, as long as it is a necessary and proper thing to help the country function. And he argues that that clause right there is vague enough to imply the existence of something like a bank. He calls that implied powers. So he argues that creating a bank is constitutional because it is implied. And that is going to be something known as a loose constructionist point of view for the Constitution. Jefferson will argue the opposite, saying that the Constitution has to be followed to the letter, and that is a strict constructionist debate. He doesn't like a bank. He says there's no bank in the Constitution, doesn't allow. They will eventually work out a compromise where the bank does appear in exchange for DC getting created near Virginia. But this debate will appear much more later with the first party system. More on that a little bit later. So, perhaps the biggest things is Washington also has a couple issues on his plate, both at home and abroad. And some of them involve the Native American policy of the country. We see that America is going to continue to expand its borders with the Land and Northwest Ordinances, even though there are already people living in these regions. And we said expansion with honor, but really, we're not really going to do that. The example we showed in class was the Battle of Fallen Timbers, which will result in a massacre of a coalition of Northwest Native Americans. And so there will be a treaty that will allow for greater expansion, but it was not obtained very cleanly. However, this new government does show it's much more effective at dealing with internal dissent because we saw under Shays' Rebellion, the Articles government could do nothing about it during peacetime. The Whiskey Rebellion, which will be caused by the whiskey tax created under Hamilton's economic plan, is going to hurt farmers unfairly. And we see that this Whiskey Rebellion is put down very quickly by George Washington personally. And so that's going to show that the government is much stronger. At the same time, we see there's a foreign policy issue here where the French Revolution is going to kick off a war in Europe. Britain and France, among others, are going to be at war with each other. And America wants to stay neutral here. We are morally aligned with France because they're fighting for the same idea of liberty and natural rights as we did not too long ago. But we still rely on Britain economically for all that manufactured stuff that we don't make. So we want to try to not tick off either of them, and we declare our neutrality. However, it ends up that due to a bunch of other shenanigans, that's only going to make both of them mad at us. And they're both going to resort to something called impressment, where basically they will stop our ships at sea. They will take cargo whenever they feel like it. They will confiscate entire ships and the crew with it, basically being just drafted into the British or French Navy. And so we don't really have a navy to defend ourselves, and that's going to be a major problem. At the same time, we do see that there are a few attempts to resolve things like this. The Jay Treaty with Britain was an attempt to try and stop this impressment, but we can't really negotiate with them in any way. And so it's actually going to be a very favorable treaty to Britain. We give them so much and get nothing in return because really we don't even get the impressment to stop. The only good that comes out of it is some level of normalcy with Great Britain, which is nice. And then the Pinckney Treaty, it's with Spain because they're also at war with France. And the fact that we just negotiated with Britain makes them think we're on Britain's side as an ally. Basically, Pinckney Treaty, we get the Mississippi River open to commerce and we get the right of deposit in New Orleans. So that's a big thing. Lastly, as Washington is packing it up, he issues a farewell address to the whole country, basically warning about some of the dangers he's seen as president. And in particular, this treaty warns of two things: no political parties. We see Hamilton and Jefferson are already forming this kind of faction. He argues that that is a bad thing. That's only going to lead to division later on. He's going to say that, and they're both going to ignore him. The second thing, no permanent alliances with other countries. No foreign entanglements is what he calls it. He argues it leads to nothing but bad vibes, and we should just keep to ourselves with a policy of isolationism. That's going to be a big thing of his. And so we'll see that those two become a very big deal throughout a lot of this class. So it'd be good to just to know those two. Just no political parties, no foreign entanglements. All right. Now, going back to that party system, both sides are going to not listen to him. And just very briefly, looking at the different types of the political parties here, the Federalist Party, created by Hamilton, is going to be a favor of the new big federal government. They are a fan of loose constructionism, this idea of implied powers, being able to make the government bigger whenever they like. They're going to be very favorable to manufacturing and industry. Another reason why that bank was so good, to create loans to start businesses here. They argue that that's the way America is going to become prosperous. We should not have to buy stuff from Britain. We could just make it ourselves because we already make all the raw goods. So why can't we just refine those goods here? In particular, it's going to be very appealing to many areas on the coast, many like the big urban cities, people who might actually make factories like that. And naturally, until we can do that, we need to have strong economic ties with places that still make stuff for us. So they're going to be big fans of Great Britain, and they will take the side of Great Britain during that inevitable war that we just saw. They're going to like the Jay Treaty. Meanwhile, the Republican Party, aka the Democratic Republican Party, they're going to be kind of the opposite. Jefferson and his band, they're going to argue for strict constructionism, following the Constitution to the letter, because they worry the government getting too big equals tyranny. So they're a big fan of the yeoman farmer lifestyle, saying that we don't need to manufacture stuff. All we really need is a bunch of small, self-sufficient farmers who are just left alone. That is the path to prosperity. We don't need anything else. So they are very anti-big government. They want the states to be able to fend for themselves. And as a result, this is all very appealing to people in like the small cities, rural agricultural interests, and they like liberty. They support France. All right. I've gone a little bit over my time here, so I'm going to go ahead and call it there. But Please feel free to reach out if you have any of these questions here, and I'll catch you in the last video for Unit 2, looking at the Adams and Jefferson administrations. All right, take care. Bye bye.